The British people are about to have practiced upon them a trick even cruder and more shameless than that by which they were cheated out of their inheritance of parliamentary self-government in the first place when we acceded to the European Economic Community.
We fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds.
Thank you for joining us. You are listening to A Radio, and this is the Morning Moment. We're on weekdays, 11:45 Eastern. Follow us on Spreaker.com and click on the like button. I want to read this article to you. It was in the Daily Mail newspaper, Monday, April 1st. The links, as always, will be on my site. But I think, and this is just my opinion, that this was their end game all along. Now, whether by the time that this podcast comes out it's historic or not, that's really not the point. The point is the headline that I'm going to read you in a minute. Now, I'm going to read you the whole article, the majority of it, but it's the headline that kind of says it all to me. Now, the Prime Minister of the UK, who became the Prime Minister after the previous Prime Minister, who was in favour of remaining, that is, saying yes to remain, lost the Brexit vote when the majority of voters voted to leave. In reality, this current Prime Minister has dragged her feet from day one. In reality, this Prime Minister has dragged her feet from day one of taking the reins of power in the UK. The powerful behind-the-scenes lobbying went on and still goes on right up to the 11th hour of the 11th day. Theresa May clearly does not want the UK to leave the EU, and neither do the elitists behind the scenes. Their power, prestige and credibility is quite frankly on the line. The Oxford type, the Cambridge type, the Mayfair type. They know who they are, and if you don't know who they are, look them up. They're not the ordinary Brits. The ordinary Brits have had enough of the EU and the EEC that I joined, regrettably. The forcing on the Brits in the 70s of the metric system, the forcing on the Brits in the 70s of changing their system to the decimalisation system, which suited them fine for hundreds of years, but yet joining the EEC required them to have the decimal system, which changed everything and caused massive inflation in the UK. Massive inflation. Now, as Donald Trump has indicated before, there are powerful unseen forces at work here who will, just like the fake dossier in the UK, stop at nothing to achieve their goals. They care nothing for the voters, for the citizens of the UK, just their elitist ideals. I want you to listen to this piece and make your own mind up whether you feel that the elected officials on both sides, inside and outside of the government, have really negotiated in good faith. The issues they're stuck on were there from the very beginning, but just like the US Congress, with immigration and budget constraints, they have just tried to kick the can down the road, hoping that somehow it will fix itself. I put it to the general public that if these political leaders can't even deal with a simple matter like this, how on earth can they deal with the larger issues? They clearly act on a political basis and influence in all cases, rather than doing their job, which is doing the will of the people who elected them. That does not mean the will of the elite to which they aspire to be. Here's the piece, the headline. Dozens of ministers could back a customs union after May, that's Theresa May, gives in to Remainers, that's the people who want to remain in the EU, and offers them a free vote tonight, while cabinet Brexiteers threaten to quit if May backs down to soft Brexit plotters. And here are some subheadings from that piece. Theresa May will offer a free vote to her MPs on alternatives to her deal, but cabinet ministers told to abstain. MPs could vote to force the PM towards a customs union or Norway-style Brexit and try to force it on the PM. Ministers warned a shift to a soft Brexit could help Labour win an election and put Jeremy Corbyn in number 10. Oh, God forbid. I don't know how to pronounce this lady's name. Penny Mordaunt and Chris Grayling among ministers reportedly ready to resign from the government. Boris Johnson said MPs should get Brexit done and fix it when Mrs May quits in pitch to be next leader. Jacob Rees-Mogg is very concerned that Theresa May will add a customs union onto her Brexit deal. Those are just the bullet points of this piece. Dozens of Theresa May's ministers could back a customs union with the EU tonight, Monday, April 1st, as the Prime Minister caved in and offered the MPs a free vote on alternatives to her deal. Brexiteer and Remainer ministers are now in an open war with both factions ready to quit to force Mrs May towards either no deal or a softer Brexit. MPs will decide tonight on whether to try to force the Prime Minister to shift to a customs union or Norway-style soft Brexit. The Cabinet is due to have a 5-hour showdown summit tomorrow to decide what to do with the outcome of the votes. Today, it was revealed that Tories will be given a free vote on the alternatives to Mrs May's deal, with 25 or more junior ministers predicted to be ready to back a softer Brexit. Cabinet ministers have been told to abstain, but with a growing rift between Remainers and Brexiteers in the government, some could choose to vote for a customs union and resign. Tory Brexiteer Jacob Rees-Mogg today admitted that he was very concerned that Theresa May will add a customs union onto her Brexit deal to get through Parliament. He told LBC Radio, "My concern is that the Prime Minister is more concerned to avoid a no-deal Brexit than anything else, and therefore I'm very concerned that she could decide to go for a customs union tacked onto her deal." Mr Rees-Mogg also said Friday's vote on the Brexit deal would probably have gone through if it had been Mrs May's deal versus a general election. Number 10 is braced for a possible cabinet walkout as early as tomorrow, when ministers debate to accept Parliament's demands. Senior ministers have warned the Prime Minister she would destroy the Tory party and put Jeremy Corbyn into number 10 if she demands to adopt a soft Brexit. If she were to give way to a softer Brexit, Mrs May would provoke a furious reaction from Brexiteers, with the International Development Secretary Penny Mordaunt and the Transport Secretary Chris Grayling among ministers reportedly ready to resign. But more than 170 Tory MPs, including 10 cabinet ministers, have already signed a blunt 2-paragraph letter to Mrs May, reminding her of the party's manifesto commitment to take Britain out of both the customs union and the single market. The letter urges her to take the UK out of the EU without a deal on April 12 if she cannot get her own deal through Parliament in the coming days. Today, Chief Secretary of the Treasury Liz Truss said, "I don't have any fear of a no deal. What would be worse is if we don't Brexit at all." But regarding expectations, Mrs May will try a 4th vote on her deal. She said, "Think the answer lies in modifications to the Prime Minister's deal to be able to get to have the support." She also warned the Prime Minister against lurching towards a customs union deal because it's not clear that going softer is the way to command support, but ruled out quitting. Mrs May's deal has now fallen 3 times in the Commons, with dozens of Tory MPs among those who voted against it on each occasion. The following bit is a timetable for 4 days of Westminster turmoil. That's the title. Today, Monday, MPs led by Tory Sir Oliver Letwin and Labour's Yvette Cooper will vote tonight on whether to adopt a soft Brexit option, such as a customs union or membership of the single market, possibly accompanied by a second referendum. Last week, MPs rejected all 8 Brexit options put to them in a series of indicative votes, but supporters of soft Brexit from both the Tory and the Labour benches believe they have a better chance tonight following the third defeat of Theresa May's deal. Tomorrow, Tuesday, the Cabinet will meet to discuss a response of the votes. If the MPs have backed a custom union, Mrs May will have to decide whether to accept policy opposed to the vast majority of Tory MPs. If she agrees, the issue could tear apart the party. If she refuses, it would result in a constitutional standoff, which could spark a general election. Downing Street fears that she could face a cabinet walkout regardless of what she decides. Wednesday, Sir Oliver Letwin has indicated he will try to seize control of the Commons agenda to pursue his soft Brexit plan if Monday's votes were inconclusive. They could be held again, possibly using preferential voting to reduce the options to 1. If Monday night's vote produced a solution, but Mrs May refused to adopt it, Parliament could legislate in a bid to force her hand. Thursday, allies of the PM have the day penciled in for a possible 4th attempt to get her deal through the Commons. They believe that the majority against her, coming down from 230 to 149 and then last week to 58, they have the momentum on their side. Ministers are considering an unprecedented parliamentary runoff, pitting Mrs May's deal against the soft Brexit option, chosen by MPs in the hope of focusing the minds of the Tory Eurosceptics. DUP Brexit spokesman Sammy Wilson said today this party will reject her deal if it was brought back 1,000 times. He said, as far as the withdrawal agreement is concerned and the motion before us is concerned, our position has not changed. We have sought to, over the last number of weeks, to work with the government to try and find a way of either getting legal assurances or legislative changes which would enable us to move these processes on. We want to see a deal because we want out of the European Union and we want to have a clear path as to how we do it. The DUP is the Democratic Unionist Party, which is a party in Northern Ireland. It is our regret that the process has reached an end. Environment Secretary Michael Gove: one thing is clear, we have to leave the European Union in good order. Parliament won't vote for no deal. No deal is bad. No deal is bad for our economy and bad for our union. Last night, 2 cabinet ministers told the Daily Mail that shifting to a soft Brexit could lead to a collapse of the government and usher in a Labour regime led by Mr Corbyn. One said, if forced to choose, I favour a general election over a customs union, but it's like a choice between being stabbed in the left hand or being stabbed in the right. Either one could take us to a Corbyn government. The Conservative Party cannot accept a customs union, and at least half the cabinet won't accept it. It would destroy the party and would lead to an election anyway, which we would then lose. The only route we can possibly survive is to go for a no deal. At least we would then enter an election in the right political place, having delivered Brexit. Another cabinet minister said, we cannot go for a customs union. There would be no government left. And if we go for an election, then Corbyn will likely win and we would end up with a customs union anyway. Justice Secretary David Gauke infuriated Eurosceptic MPs yesterday when he declared that Mrs May would have to look closely at adopting a customs union if Parliament votes for it. Meanwhile, Boris Johnson urged the Tories to believe in Britain and get Brexit done. Writing in the Daily Telegraph, he said, "We should really come out with no deal, now looking by far the best option. But if we cannot achieve that, then we need to get out now, with an interim solution that most closely resembles what the people voted for. In the knowledge that the Prime Minister's decision to step down, we have at least the chance to fix it in the second phase of the negotiations." Mr. Gawke and fellow Remainers Greg Clerk, Amber Rudd, Philip Hammond, David Livington are urging Mrs May to push for a softer Brexit if it avoids no deal. Last night, members of the group were privately encouraging Remainer Tories to back the option in tonight's vote. But Downing Street slapped down Mr Gawke, saying Mrs May was committed to delivering a Brexit deal which does not include membership of the customs union. However, the pro-Remain cabinet source said Mrs May would have to accept the will of the Parliament, adding that something is going to have to give this week. She is finally going to have to pick a side, and that is going to leave one half of the cabinet very unhappy. But if the majority of Parliament comes out for a customs union, then that will be very hard to resist. At the start of another dramatic week for Brexit, here are the following bullet points. Government sources said Mrs May would try to bring her deal back to the Commons for a fourth time this week, despite hopes fading that the DUP will support it. Before any fourth vote on the deal, a new round of indicative votes will be held on the alternatives in the Commons tonight. European Commissioner President Jean-Claude Juncker said, "We have a lot of patience with our British friends over Brexit, but patience runs out." Tory Deputy Chairman James Cleverly warned that Mrs May could lead the party into a snap election if Brexit deadlock continues, despite the opposition from the Tory MPs and the poll putting Labour 5 points ahead. Work and Pension Secretary Mrs Rudd set up a new group of moderate Tories designed to block the hard Brexiteers such as Dominic Raab and Boris Johnson, succeeding Mrs May as PM. Labour shifted decisively behind a second referendum, with Tom Watson saying it is inconceivable the party would not back the idea, and Emily Thornberry declaring, "In my heart, I want to stay." Whitehall sources said Cabinet Secretary Sir Mark Sedwell have convinced Mrs May to drop the idea of leaving the EU without the deal, after warning her it would lead to the breakup of the UK. MPs are expected to take part in the second stage of the Brexit indicative vote process on Monday. None of the 8 alternatives to the Prime Minister Theresa May's deal were approved last week after Parliament seized control of the Commons agenda. Many of the ideas have returned for a second attempt, with Speaker John Bercow the person responsible for selecting the ones that can be put to a vote. Motion A. I'm going to read out a series of motions. Motion A. Unilateral right of exit from the backstop. Brexiteer Tory backbenchers led by Basildon and Billericay's John Barron want the UK to leave the EU on May 22nd, with the withdrawal agreement amended to allow the UK to unilaterally exit the controversial Northern Ireland backstop. The EU has consistently refused to reopen the withdrawal agreement, and that was agreed last year, and even Downing Street now accept that this idea is a non-starter. And if this amendment was passed, it would run contrary to the extension agreed with the EU leaders in the last 2 weeks. In order to get an extension to May 22nd, which was dependent on the current WA, whatever withdrawal agreement I imagine that means, being passed last Friday. In addition, John Bercow is not likely to allow it to proceed, as it is only backed by a small number of Tory Brexiteers. That's a blinking mouthful and a half, isn't it? Motion B. No deal in the absence of a withdrawal deal. This is an even more extreme motion by Mr. Barron and a hardcore group of European Research Group holdouts, including Andrew Bridgeton and John Redwood. Mr. Barron calls for a no-deal Brexit on April 12 if no withdrawal agreement can be agreed by the Commons, while while a no-deal Brexit remains the default option if no deal or alternative is passed by MPs or parliamentarians have already voted against it. A very similar motion last week lost by 400 votes to 160 votes, the widest margin of any of the 8 that were put to the vote. Motion C. These are absolute mouthful. Tory former Chancellor Ken Clarke's Customs Union plan requires any Brexit deal to include as a minimum a commitment to negotiate a permanent and comprehensive UK-wide customs union with the EU. This is where tonight's vote could get interesting. This amendment last week lost by the tightest margin of all. It went down by 8 votes, losing 272 to 264. It means a handful of MPs changing their minds could see it cross the line. But the SNP, that's Scottish National Party, and the Liberal Democrats abstained last time. So those votes may not be easy to find on the polarised Tory Labour benches. And if it did win, it would cause havoc in the government and Brexiteers going on the warpath. Motion D. Common Market 2. A cross-party motion tabled by Conservatives Nick Bowles, Robert Halfan and Dame Caroline Spellman, and the Labour's Stephen Kinnock, Lucy Powell, plus SNP's Stuart Hosey. The motion proposes UK membership of the European Free Trade Association and the European Economic Area. It allows continued participation in the single market and a comprehensive customs arrangement with the EU after Brexit, including a UK say in future EU trade deals, would remain in place until the agreement of a wider trade deal which guarantees frictionless movement of goods and an open border in Ireland. Despite Labour backing last week, this lost by more than 100 votes, but 167 MPs abstained, including the DUP. If the Northern Irish Party could be talked into backing it, there could be some movement. Motion E. Second referendum to approve Brexit deal. Drawn up by Labour's Peter Kyle and Phil Wilson, this motion would require a public vote to confirm any Brexit deal passed by Parliament before its ratification. This option, tabled last time by Labour's former Minister Dame Margaret Beckett, tabled in the British sense means putting it forward, rather than the American sense, which means shelving, polled the highest number of votes, although it was defeated 295 to 268. Labour MPs were whipped to support it, but 27, mainly from northern leaving voting areas, voted against it, and a further 18, including several frontbenchers, abstained. Their support would be enough to pass it, but it seems unlikely they will change their minds, given their concerns remain the same. Motion F. Public vote to prevent no deal. Moved by Labour's Graham Jones and Tory former Minister Dominic Grieve, this proposal would require a referendum if necessary to prevent the UK leaving the EU without a deal. Grieve is a hardcore Remainer who lost a confidence vote in his local Beaconsfield party at the weekend, and he has long been a thorn in the side of the Prime Minister. It seeks to build on a motion tabled last week to revoke Article 50 altogether to avoid leaving with no deal, which was defeated by more than 100 votes. But there are only the signatures to this motion, so it is unlikely to be called by the Speaker. Motion G. Parliamentary supremacy. SNP Joanna Cherry joins with Mr Grieve and MPs from other parties with this plan to seek an extension to the Brexit process to allow Parliament and government to achieve a Brexit deal. If this is not possible, then Parliament will choose between no deal or revoking Article 50. An inquiry would follow to assess the future relationship likely to be acceptable to Brussels and have a majority support in the UK. This has wide cross-party support, so could still be called by the Speaker. Motion H. A European Free Trade Association and Economic Area. Motion tabled by Conservative MP George Eustace, who quit as Agricultural Minister to fight for Brexit, proposing rejoining EFTA at the earliest opportunity, It also calls for a short extension to the UK's membership of the EU to conclude accession to EFTA and negotiate with the EU additional protocols relating to Northern Ireland border and agro-food trade. This is unlikely to be put to a vote, as an almost identical motion attracted the backing of just 65 MPs, so would be most certain to fail of all this time. Well, the article continues, and I wanted to read all that out verbatim as best I could, but it's verbal verbiage as far as I'm concerned. If you weave your way through the narrative there, the MPs in the House of Commons in the UK are usurping the voice of the voters of the British public who voted unanimously to leave the EU. It was an unambiguous vote. There is no argument. If you allow politicians to bypass that vote, ignore it, or have another vote because they don't like the result of the first vote, then that's not democracy. That's just a voting system to keep voting until you get the vote you want. That's not democracy. The vast number of UK citizens who voted to leave the EU. However you do it, you leave. Whether it upsets a few people in one part of the country, too darn bad. Too darn bad. And if it causes the collapse of the British government, too darn bad. Too darn bad. Britain voted to leave. They don't want the EU. I don't blame them. They should get rid of the metric system as well, but that's another thing. But they voted to leave. If the EU wants to drag its feet and demand billions of pounds, so be it. And if the British government can't get a deal through Parliament, so be it. Those are the options. But to just vote on removing Article 50, which is the right for the British government to remove itself from the EU, surely is unconstitutional in some way. It has to be. That is usurping the views of British citizens. In Canada, I liken that to Trudeau, who is a communist. We have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which I've mentioned the other day. I'm going to continue to mention this until Canadians wake up and realise that they're being conned. Both the Liberals and the Conservatives and the NDP and that communist bloc in Quebec, the bloc, they voted in favour of a law that bans free speech in Canada, which is unconstitutional. It's against our charter. Yet, crickets. I don't believe in this case that Brits will stand by and let that be crickets. If this government or any government tries to usurp the voter, I think there'll be riots on the streets. And I think the same thing's going to happen in Canada at some point, because Trudeau is not democratic. And I don't think much of Andrew Scheer, to be honest with you. He doesn't strike me as democratic either. No voter in Canada, for instance, voted for a carbon dioxide tax, a tax on breathing, which people conveniently forget. This is my concern in the UK, that people are being usurped. Their democratic right to vote is being usurped by a few parliamentarians who are being swayed by some unknown and unseen force. And I fear what the outcome of that will actually be, not what they expect. And that's my comment for today. You can find more at aradio.wordpress.com, where you can find links to us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Gab and email. We're also on Spotify. Just go to the podcast section and type Canadian Politics with a twist and you'll find us. We are continuing to reach out to you, so please pass on these links. Please click on the follow button on Spreaker.com. You can listen to all our morning moments at Spreaker.com under A Radio. That's EHRADIO, A Radio, and click on the like button. And you can hear a review of our morning moments on WHBJ-DB, News Talk Radio on Spreaker.com. Join us and many others. And you can find all our podcasts and morning moments at aradio.wordpress.com. Click on the Morning Moments tab.